Hello and welcome to Late Night JP on ATP Geo FA. It's a late one for me. Another late one. It's because it's Christmas time and things are busy, so apologies for the tardiness. This is another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce, a Frontline update for the 22nd of December 2023. Before we go to the front line, if you don't know what the lines on my map mean, please check out the map key on the screen at the moment. Pause the video if you want to. Right, let's go to the front line. I'm not going to go to the ISW or anything for a granular look at the front line because it's a little bit out of date. Want to do these later night ones. You know, I'm waiting for the new ISW report to come out anyway, so I'm just going to go to the pins that I've done. I hope JR gets well soon. He's ill with COVID at the moment. He helps me so much with my mapping, and that's partly why I'm a little bit late, because it does take an awful lot of time, and I do value him. He's awesome. So what do we have? Northeastern sector, no changes in the Kupiansk area around Sinkivka, no changes to the mapping there for either any of my source mappers. So we come down actually to quite a large change to the north of the salient west of Kreminna. This is the salient on the way to Terny, Yampolivka, Torska area. So it's actually here in the Terny area where we have seen footage of fighting coming out over the last few days. It looks like, as according to Andrew Perpetua's map, that the Russians have made some quite significant gains there, although that falls in line with what Surat Maps had said before. Andrew Perpetua is somewhat more conservative and waits for enough evidence to be more sure of territorial gains, whereas I think Surat Maps sometimes jumps on any gains and then possibly walks them back. I think there might be an example of that later, although I'm not sure. It's seems to be the case at the moment that Surat Maps is broadly correct with the Russian advances at the moment, although it might be at times overzealous, or it's more likely the situation that there are elements of Russians in place and he'll say, right, that's taken, but it's not actually robustly taken, but it probably will be going forward. But he jumps on that and actually ends up being correct as it happens, but probably at the time of claiming it's not really there's not really conclusive enough evidence of the robust level of control over areas that maybe someone like Andrew Perpetua would expect. But yeah, so Russians are making gains west of Kreminna. And then when we come down to Bakhmut, it's actually in the sort of Vesely area around Berestova, where the Russians are making some fairly significant gains in a couple of places. Andrew Perpetua catching up a little bit with Surat Maps here in some of the area just northwest of Berestova, and then more directly west of Berestova. Surat Maps has some pretty large gains there. Indeed, this is what it looks like on their map. So Russian army continuing advancing northwest of Berestova and along the railway towards Vyimka. Vyimka is up here, and this railway they've actually had some success moving along here recently, but it has taken them an awful long time. I mean, you know, this has been a long time in coming, really, over a year to make those kind of gains, but nonetheless they are having success there. So we are seeing lots more sort of red pins, and again to the northwest of Bakhmut, the Russians gaining in the Kromova-Bodanivka area. Two mappers here, Andrew Perpetua and Deep State Map, agreeing that the Russians have made some gains there to go towards where Surat Maps had earlier mapped, and this is sort of north of the dirt track here that Surat Maps has under control of the Russians. Deep State Map has the Russians down the sort of middle, and Andrew Perpetua has the Russians still on the edge of that dirt track, but it remaining in the grey zone. So anyway, north of there, Andrew Perpetua and Deep State Map having some fairly substantial gains for the Russians again. But actually, it seems to be somewhat calmer to the south and indeed to the west of Bakhmut in the Ivaniska direction. At least there's no mapping changes there today. Slight change around Klishchivka, just around a railway line where Deep State map has a small area of gain for the Russians going towards where Suriyat maps is in that area, a little bit past Andrew Pecher. But yeah, fairly small change there. If we look at some of the sources about Bakhmut, we have military labs saying the Russian offensive north of Bakhmut is not going that smoothly anymore. Another trench line recaptured by units of the Ukrainian 10th Mountain Assault Brigade currently operating in the Vasily-Sperna axis. So this is going against what we may have seen from the other mappers up here. This is in the kind of Sperna-Vasily area, so exactly where we're talking about. We have just been talking about null reports saying that defenders of the 8th Mountain Battalion, part of the 10th Mountain Brigade, repelled a Russian assault. Brave heroes that stand their ground. It ended in several Russians being taken captive. So there's video footage to suggest that. It's a 2-minute long piece of video. Of course, you know, you may see a bit of video like that looks pretty good for the Ukrainians in that case, but actually when the Russians are able to use greater numbers of troops, it doesn't matter if they have the odd attack repelled here and there. They can keep those waves going. There is some reporting going on that in certain areas they're running out of Storm Z units and they're using conventional forces more and more, being forced to. So that talks to this idea that they don't really have these huge depths of the reserves. I mean, there's all this consistent talk that do they have reserves, don't they have reserves? And they appear to have reserves in certain areas that can be brought to bear. And the reporter from Ukraine was talking in their video about how Krinky has been serving as a way of drawing troops away from other areas of the front line to Krinky. And although the Russians appear to be taking Krinky back and pushing the Ukrainians out more and more from there, although we'll talk about this a little bit later, they are taking huge losses in the area. And there's some talk of sort of 150 vehicles being lost, or pieces of equipment being lost in that area, and huge numbers of troops. So although the Ukrainians might not have increased their bridgehead, they have succeeded in alleviating other areas of frontline where those troops might have been used. And likewise, there's this idea of robbing Peter to pay Paul in certain areas, and then in other areas they seem to get fresh reserves from further back. And I was talking the other day about, well, there was 20,000 odd troops in Belarus at one point, and all the Russian troops have been brought out of there. So you know, these will be brought in. You'll have fresh conscripts and mobilized troops being brought in on a consistent basis. So there are reserves, but I won't say that they're necessarily going to be, you know, decent, experienced reserves. There'll be people who've been training back here maybe for some time, but pretty green around the edges, and then you know, mobilized, but otherwise the experienced troops they do pull from reserves are actually not really reserves. They're from other areas of the front line. Anyway, I digress. You get the point that actually it's difficult for the Russians, and although, as Military Labs says here, and no reports that here's a successful repulsion of a Russian attack, that doesn't mean that ultimately the Russians won't take those positions and make gains. They have just the sheer weight of numbers to their advantage, more so than the Ukrainians, and that's a kind of calculation they seem to be making consistently. Right, as we come down to Avdiivka, you can see, well, that's good news. There's no changes to the front line around Avdiivka, around that cauldron there, and that is indeed good stuff. Here, there's some talk again from Military Lab, the aftermath of another Russian attack being, or as he says, crushed in Stepova. Russian positions near Stepova getting their daily dose of 25mm Bushmaster cannon fire from the Ukrainian Bradleys. New Russian armoured losses spotted in the tree line adjacent to the village, indicating that 47th Mechanized Brigade has stopped another powerful wave of Russian attacks. Look towards the end of the video on the left side. So I can't really show you this video, unfortunately, but lots of geolocation here for stuff getting attacked, and Bradleys do seem to be doing a pretty good job around the Stepova area, north of Avdiivka, where I think the 47th brigade were brought in to help. Let's have a look. Yeah, so this is again around Stepova, where the Russians appear to have at least tentative control over part of Stepova, but they're being given a hard time by the Ukrainians using those Bradleys. But again, the same thing can be said here, is that for every, and it may be that the Ukrainians have pushed the Russians back, or it may be that these things are only very temporary and the Russians just have enough forces to continue to press on after taking initial losses and whatnot. So it's hard to say what this footage kind of proves, but it is good that the Ukrainians are fighting around there, and they are using things like Bradleys to decent effect. So yeah, that's Stepova area, but no changes to the mapping. But it's not to say, so when you see no pins on the map, you might think, oh, it's calm, it's a bit of a stalemate. Actually, there'll be intense fighting going on in so many of these places. We're actually going to pop down past Mariinka, where I'm sure there's tough fighting going on there as the Russians look to push westwards from there. We're going to pop down to Novomikhailivka, where, like I was saying earlier about not quite sure whether Suriyat Maps sees changes in the mapping as, well, they often say that there's a counterattack, but quite often it actually signifies just overzealous changes. And yesterday there were some changes in favour of the Ukrainians as far as Suriyat Maps were concerned in this area just to the south of Novomikhailivka, and actually they've readjusted it back upwards a bit. Whether, as you can see there, I mean, the claim here is that the Russian army took control over Zverinets defensive position and the adjacent positions of the Ukrainian army. In addition, troops advanced 1 kilometer from the pumping station south of Novomikhailivka. So, whether they didn't actually lose that and it's just a bit overzealous. I might not have changed this area just up here. I don't think I have. Right. Okay, I haven't changed this on my map and I've missed this one. Damn. Zverinets is really quite important, and this is a defensive position that I think the Russians had control over previously, and then the Ukrainians took it back again, and now it looks like they've lost it again. But these kind of defensive positions are important because they're fortified, and they take a lot of resources to take back if you do lose them. And it looks like, or at least according to Suriyat Maps, the Ukrainians have lost that area and quite a large area of land up there. I just missed that on my map update, so I do apologize, but you can imagine that there would be some pins there in that dark sort of maroon burgundy color to suggest that Suriyat Maps is saying that the Ukrainians have lost quite a bit of land there. But as you can see, there's quite a difference in the mapping anyway around here. But I'll be interested to see if Andrew Perpetua confirms that tomorrow. I presume there will be some footage to suggest that has happened for Suriyat Maps to claim that, as they seem to be fairly, as I say, fairly accurate at the moment. However, just south of Novomikhailivka, this is what Suriyat Maps claimed yesterday, that the Ukrainians had pushed the Russians back in a counterattack south of there, and there's a sort of a cemetery here, which people are arguing about. There's this industrial area, and there's this agricultural installation there, some kind of farming setup that the Ukrainians have pushed the Russians back from, and now Andrew Perpetua claiming that too. In fact, Rebar says Russian troops have continued their offensive in the Pobyeda's Zverinets fortification, Novomikhailivka triangle over the past few days. As a result of successful combined attack, a major success was achieved. Zverinets came under the control of the Russian armed forces. Now, the question is whether, because this sometimes happens, whether Suriyat Maps was just using Rebar, or whether both these are using, as I say, video evidence to suggest that. Sometimes it seems that Rebar makes some pretty bold claims that are inaccurate, and Suriyat Maps can jump on those claims and they end up not being true. But I just don't know in this situation what evidence there is to support that. But anyway, we'll move on from there. Here we have a war translated talking about Novomikhailivka. Yesterday morning, they say, another assault on a farm was repulsed in the area of Novomikhailivka village. Russians have been trying to assault this farm and a cemetery every day for months now to gain a foothold for the assault of the village itself. Below, drone follows a Russian vehicle trying to escape. And there's some drone footage. I'll move on from that because I can't show it. Assaults and bombings are intense. On one day, Russians sent, and this is pretty astounding, 64 first-person view drones at the village. Every day it's shelled with artillery and bombed with 4 to 8 guided air bombs and KABs below Ukrainian positions under intense shelling. And what happens in Novomykhailivka is that it just gets absolutely hammered with everything, as mentioned there. So you've got FAB bombs dropped from airframes, these guided glide bombs, but you also have FPV drones littering the settlement, and particularly over on the eastern side, you've got multiple launch rocket systems peppering this area too. So they just get, and artillery and mortars and whatnot. So, goodness me, being a Ukrainian trying to work in Novomykhailivka, trying to defend there is a tough job at the moment. So, as War Translated says, Ukrainian positions under intense shelling. But he continues to say Russians are having it easy would be wrong. They're facing extreme losses. As a Ukrainian soldier tells me, there are no more Storm Z, and this is what I was referring to earlier, no more Storm Zs in units in this direction. They ran out. It is a regular army assaulting now, and they're replenishing weekly. So that's that farm. No, that's the industrial area in between the two. He says, I think he's saying that's a farm area, but I thought that's industrial. It might be farmland. It might be farm units as well, but this is certainly farm units there. So, and that's the cemetery there. So, lots of activity all around there. To continue what he's saying, sadly, Ukrainian land is now full of expended munitions. Many still dangerous. Centuries later, people will still be finding these in the ground. Yet symbolically, the cross still stands in the ruins of this obliterated church in the village. So that is really tough fighting around Novomykhailivka, and I've talked about this before many times about how this is an important place for the Russians to take, and it's an important place for the Ukrainians to defend. And as such, given its importance, you would expect the Ukrainians to put up something of a fight, and they are indeed doing that. So we'll keep a close eye on that place. Anyway, as we move on, I don't really have too many sources left to share with you. There'll be activity going on along here, no doubt. But interesting couple of blue pins, again, a bit of a rarity. Fairly large-ish sort of area taken back by the Ukrainians, as according to Andrew Perpetua, or at least pushing the Russians back to the west of Robotyne. And this is significant because I've been wondering what the Ukrainians are going to do in this winter period with places like Robotyne. Do they just retreat to better defensive positions around here and just try and soak up the Russian pressure? And actually, there have been claims that they've been doing that in this kind of area and perhaps down here in the south, to the east of Novopokrovka. So, yeah, do they do effectively an operational withdrawal to better positions and then not fight, sort of hammering to tooth and nail to hold on to this whole area, because it doesn't have that much importance other than you ultimately need to take it if you're going to take everywhere, and if you want to punch through these defensive positions, you can do it from there or whatever. But realistically, it's not such a bad thing if they lose that compared to if they lose places like Novomykhailivka or indeed Avdiivka. I think they are more important. And yet the Ukrainians, this is interesting, if they are pushing back in certain places. So they are not content just to sit back and defend certain tree lines. So I guess we'll have to keep an eye on Robotyne to see what their plans are operationally around there. Let me know what you think as ever. And then finally we come down to the Krinky area where, first of all, as you will have seen probably from my breaking news update today, there were 3 Su-34 fighter bombers taken out by what is apparently a Patriot system that is being placed on the sly around the Kherson region, and taking out 3 of these bombers that would no doubt have been aiming FAB or KAB 500, 1500, however, whatever size guided glide bombs at Krinky. These were taken out here. Now, there are some rumours, in fact, Rebar is suggesting themselves that there are operational F-16s kicking about, and the idea is it could be them. I think that's probably trying to control the narrative in saying, the West has supplied these F-16s and, we're going to hit the bases, and I don't know, start ramping up the rhetoric about that. But I think if they admit that there are nice, big, expensive, chunky Patriot systems being brought into Ukraine, then actually that paints things a little bit better for the Ukrainians, and it gives them a little bit more kudos, I guess. So it may be trying to say that these F-16s, it plays better into the Russian narrative than saying, oh my goodness, they've put a Patriot system there, in the same way that Patriot system that was admitted to have taken out the 5-6 airframes in the Russian regions way back in May this year. The Russians were very quiet about that news when it came out, weren't they? So it doesn't surprise me that Rebar have suggested these F-16s. I think it'd be very, very unlikely that they are F-16 shooting down these airframes, only because I don't know that they would. F-16s have really got the definite range advantage over Russian planes, especially Su-34s. These are newer jets. I think it's just more plausible that that is a Patriot system, to be perfectly honest. But no skin off my nose as to whether it's F-16s or Patriots. I mean, brilliant stuff all round. I can't wait to see more Patriots being placed near the front lines. I've been arguing, you've heard me argue this for a long time, is that they really need to put a Patriot system somewhere near Mykolaiv, probably, and somewhere near Zaporizhia, and then start seeing these Patriot systems have an effect on the Russian air activity, the VKS activity, both in terms of helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft back behind the lines, doing close air support or hammering Ukrainian positions with their guided glide bombs. It's exactly what we want to see. And taking out 3 of those in one morning, that's $120 million worth of kit all in one, I think is fantastic. What's going to be interesting is what Ukraine do with that Patriot, if it is a Patriot. Because you can bet your bottom dollar that if it is, the Russians will be hunting that down with everything they can muster. All the Lancets you could poke a hairy stick at, they'll be looking for that to take it out. So these things I'm sure they won't hang around. They'll hang around, further back in much safer territory, like Kyiv, like maybe if there is one indeed at Starokonstantinov in Khmelnytsky's defending that airbase, as is rumoured. They've got a number have been provided by allies. They've got 5 on the way from Raytheon at different. Who knows when they're going to get there? But it wouldn't surprise me if they end up having more Patriots earlier than you think, because my goodness, they'll be desperate for them. Now, the bad news is, so that's the good news. The bad news is, according to Andrew Perpetua, the Russians are pushing the Ukrainians out of Krynki bit by bit, and that bridgehead is being squeezed. As you can see here from the map, Andrew Perpetua is moving his line towards Surat Maps. Surat Maps has a much worse situation in this thin part of the actual town there, whereas actually in the forest area, slightly more charitable to the Ukrainians. But I think it's, as I've said for a long time, I think it will be really tough for the Ukrainians in Krynki. I think it will be expensive for them in terms of troops. There's no way it can't be. The amount of bombs that are hitting this area, the fact that the Ukrainians have taken out 3 thermobaric TOS 1A pieces of kit over the last week is, well, it's bad for the Russians, obviously, but it also indicates that the Russians must be absolutely hammering Krynki. And there's not a lot of places you can hide there, really. So I think the Ukrainians are going to be incurring some pretty significant losses here. But, and this is kind of what I've said about Bakhmut, what I say all the time, is you would assume that they're staying there if it is useful for them to do so. And they are doing, again, it's like Bakhmut, they are They are fixing Russian troops here. They're attracting Russian troops here from fighting from elsewhere. That's a claim in the reporting from Ukraine video today. And they are attriting those troops and equipment at pretty substantial rates by all accounts in this area. As I mentioned earlier, there are some counts of 150 vehicles that the Russians have lost, and that is huge. So the Krinky is an expensive area, so that could well justify the Ukrainians hanging on with their fingernails to the last sort of vestiges of Krinky as they're getting squeezed and squeezed. Now, what will be interesting is if the Patriot, that or the downing of the 3 Su-34s, which is pretty much confirmed by Russian sources now. I know some Russian pro-Kremlin voices are like talking about propaganda this and propaganda that, but the Russian sources are admitting it. I believe 2 of the crew are dead. 1 crew member might have survived, but the toll on experienced Russian fighter pilot crews will be huge. The living ones will be afraid of flying, and they will just have a lack of expertise. Every time these pilots are lost, it's a massive hit for either side, right? So it's not just about losing the airframe. It's almost more important that the pilots are taken out. But anyway, so this could indicate good news for the Ukrainians, or it is good news for the Ukrainians, but it could, I don't know, motivate the Ukrainians to push harder now that potentially the Russians are not going to be hitting the forces here with their FAB bombs. So we'll have to see over the next few days, week or so, to see whether the Russians continue to push the Ukrainians out or whether the Ukrainians get a bit of momentum on the back of those Su-34 losses. Anyway, thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe and share. Really appreciate all of your support. Time for me to hit the haystack or hit the pillow or whatever. It's late now and my brain's not working. So see you next time.